All right, we're good
Okay.
to go.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Sorry for the delay. We had some issues with trying to get Zoom access last minute. But I hope you all are excited for today's session. I know I am. And we have a really cool speaker lined up today. But before we jump right in, I thought we'll just spend a couple minutes talking about what Spark is, because I know we have a wider audience than what we're used to seeing typically. And we are excited to have our friends in bits also join us. So we'll spend some time talking about Spark, and then introduce our speaker Caleb, and then get going maybe in about 5 minutes or so, right? So with that, let me just get started on some Spark slides. All right, so about Spark, right? We are a nonprofit. It was a mentoring initiative that was started by ICT alumni Amar Arsiwala and Anusha, who are also good friends of mine. And it was focused on mentorship, education, giving back, and sort of helping the students who are currently in their undergrad or graduate programs in India develop the right skill set that's needed for either pursuing higher education or working, in the industry or wherever. So we wanted to sort of offer something that complements the current academic curriculum, and our team, which has a genuine passion for mentorship and education. Just sort of having been in your shoes not too long ago, have seen the challenges that students face, and we've basically identified a few parts that are missing in some ways in the traditional academic curriculum. Things like professional peripheral skill set development, resources on career guidance, scientific training, and even mentorship, right, which has been extremely valuable for a lot of us in our professional careers so far. So that's kind of what Spark is all about, and we hope we can make a difference to the Indian education system as well, and students who are sort of going through um, that particular curriculum program. So our journey so far, we have had about a year and a half of really cool sessions and programs. So Spark currently offers 5 different types of modules or programs. We started with the Achieve session, which is focused on professional skill set development. So it's things like, how do you prepare for job interviews? Do you think about what do you need to think about when you're pursuing higher education, be it MS, PhD, or an MBA? It could be things like resume writing, or even today's session, which is focused on problem solving and data-driven decisioning. So it's basically sort of equipping you with the skills that you need to complement, your sort of core skill set, right? We then have the Inspire session, which is focused on career guidance. So it's basically us bringing recent alumni who have pursued different career paths. So the goal of this module is to equip students with just thinking about various possibilities for career options. We didn't really know of all of these paths when we were in our undergrads, and it's been eye-opening. So we just wanted to pay that forward. Um, the next piece is around mentorship. So that's our Engage module, wherein we've basically sort of paired current students with recent alumni who share mutual interests, and that's kind of our take on trying to provide one-to-one, more personalized mentorship for students, which has been useful for us as well in the past. So for this, you can obviously sort of sign up on the website. We've had one cohort last year, which has been super successful. We just closed registrations for the second cohort, but you can absolutely sign up on our website, sparkmentoring.info, and we'll be sure to sort of loop you in for the next cohort as well. The next module that I'll talk about is Empower, which is our communication skill development piece. So this was sort of founded based off of feedback from students and teachers that were saying that, current undergrad students or grad students in India, are not as confident with communication, be it public speaking or even written communication. So we've sort of created a module that's focused on just this. So we have, 4 workshop sessions that are broken out in a small batch setting of about 30 students or so. And we basically want to focus on personalized coaching for that particular purpose. We launched last year. We had a very successful first cohort, and registrations are currently open for the second cohort, which will begin in August. So again, please, go to the website and, sign up if you're interested. I know it will be absolutely, absolutely helpful. And then finally, we've had Innovate launched not too long ago, which is just focused on scientific and technical training. So it's things like how do you write papers, how do you think about, a new technical concept and things like that, right? So this is mostly focused on people who want to pursue a more technical path in the near term, after wherever they are right now. So that's Spark in a nutshell. It's essentially the 5 modules that I just spoke about. Today's session, as I mentioned earlier, would sort of fall under the Achieve module, and that's what I help drive. And I'm super excited to welcome today's speaker, Caleb, who happens to be my MBA classmate as well, and a very good friend. But a little about Caleb, he is currently a principal product manager at Amazon in the Amazon Music team. He was previously with the Alexa team, so he's always been used to doing really cool work. He pursued his MBA obviously at Emory University, but then he also graduated from BITS Pilani in 2010 with his undergrad degree in civil engineering. He has about 10 years of experience, spanning analytics, working with startups, doing product management, implementation, be it across the globe or even multiple industries, right? So he's sort of seen a lot and done a lot of really cool things. But if he has some free time, which I'm surprised he still does with all of that, he actually manages to somehow find time for. Caleb lives in Atlanta and in his free time works, with his local church. He enjoys playing the drums, and he's really, really, really good at it. He plays football. He's a big Chelsea fan. I won't give him gripe about that. Uh, and rides around in a skateboard. But more importantly, as you can see on the picture, he has a new fur baby. His name is Elvis, who's you'll probably see randomly pop up on your screen when you're looking at Caleb's video. But Elvis is kind of mostly consuming Caleb's time right now. So welcome, Caleb, and there you go. Welcome, Elvis, as well. And thank you for taking the time, to help Spark with today's session. I know it's going to be a really exciting session ahead. So before we begin, just one quick housekeeping item. I know all of you are going to have a lot of questions along the way. So the way we typically manage this is that we have a Q&A session right at the end. And we use Pigeonhole as a medium to sort of collate different questions and, pick the ones that are liked or the most popular. So you can scan the QR code and start entering your questions during the presentation. And at the end, I will sort of modulate that and then see if, if moderate that, sorry, and then see if, what questions need to be answered. You can like questions that other people have also posted, so you don't have to repeat questions. And, we'll have a standard sort of Q&A format at the end, right? So please take the time to ask questions. Caleb has been nice enough to stay back as well and answer those at the end. So make use of it. And then finally, we also will share a link to a feedback form in the chat window. Just take about 20-30 seconds to just help us improve. It's going to be extremely important to us. And I know it's been useful in our shaping Spark's curriculum and modules as well. So if you can take the time to, spare some feedback, that'll be super helpful as well. All right, so I know you probably don't want to hear me talk anymore. I will keep quiet now and I guess pass the baton to Caleb to start with today's session. Caleb, all you. Anusha, I think you probably need to unmute Caleb.
Okay, before I get started, actually, Natu, if you don't mind going back to your slide on the journey or like the 5 modules, I just want to share a little bit about why I decided to do this, and how, like, why I care. So maybe if you could go back to that slide, I want to say a couple of things before I get started.
Absolutely. There you go.
I mean, I just mainly this is my first time looking at this slide, so I didn't know a lot. Thought of a couple of these things, why I decided to do this really crystallized as I was looking at this. For me personally, I'm sure a lot of people on this call have a similar experience where we've seen education be a means of really catapulting us outside of our small little cocoons of where we grew up and things like that. But for me personally, even going back a couple more generations, my grandfather on my dad's side came from a pretty poor family, and he was the oldest sibling. He had about 4 other siblings. He really wanted to study and actually become a math professor, but couldn't do it because he had to go work so that he could support his other siblings to go to school, which he did. And later in life, he actually ended up becoming a math professor, which is quite inspiring for me. But all that to say, I think what I've seen is education and mentorship has uh, really been a practical way to lift yourself up outside of where your current scenario is to the next level. So that's something that motivates me to want to give back. The other thing, I recently watched an interview with Ellen, who is finishing her show. One of the things a guest of hers actually said, that there's sort of 3 stages to everyone's like life or professional career. The first is master, second is mentor, and the third is make a difference. So just to recap what that means, master is just the time in your life where you spend trying to be good at something that you do. And then as you're doing that, you're also mentoring and coaching other people as you're growing, but you're also helping them grow. And then eventually you get to a stage where you can make a difference. And I think this initiative, and part of why I like it, is it really focuses on mentorship and making a difference, which I'm really glad to be doing. So yeah, with that said, I'll jump in to my presentation. My only caveat is I have not made PowerPoint in like 4 years. So and I haven't
Blame
presented
Amazon for
like
that.
this in a long time, so spare me a little bit, or give me some grace. All right, to get started, I think there are almost 20 something people. First of all, thank you again for your time. I'd like to start by saying that this is probably one of the most important skills I have learned in the recent 5 to 6 years, through business school and also having worked in the US. And so I'm glad to be doing this. Feel free to think of questions along the way, and we can answer them towards the end. With that said, I'll get started. So for today's session, there's sort of 2 sections I want to focus on. The first is problem solving, and the second is data-driven decision making. And within problem solving, I have a few things I'd like to focus on. The first, I want to set some context on why it's important, why we need structure, what are the key steps involved in it. And then I'll share the example of one particular tool that I have found works well. There are many tools. This is not to say that this tool is better than the others. It's just the one that I tend to use the most, and it works for me. If we have time, we might do an exercise, but we may run short. With that said, I want to jump in. So one thing I have learned is that problem solving is inescapable and a key skill differentiator in today's business world. Um, any job you do, anything you work on, you'll sort of face this irrespective of which career path you embark on. So whatever I'm sharing, I'm trying to keep it generic enough, but for the context of today's examples, I'll maybe focus a little bit more on business kind of scenarios, working scenarios, but know that the same logic could be applied to any problem solving methodology. In fact, one of the best problem solving books on structured problem solving is I'll share the link later on, but the whole book is written about how a guy or a professor loses his dog and then finds his dog using a structured problem solving method. So with that said, I'll define what I'm going to be focusing on here. I'm going to focus on helping us find an optimal solution to uncertain or complex issues that can help achieve a desired outcome. And like I said, the focus for today will be business problems that you will encounter in your jobs or the workplace. So this next slide, I think I'm just going to talk a little bit about why we need structure. There's many pros and cons. We can discuss it later. But one of the key reasons is it prevents problem solvers from jumping to conclusions. And what I mean by this is it's usually tempting to propose a solution before a problem is properly defined and its root cause is identified. And having a structured problem solving method prevents that short circuiting of the process and ensures sort of the critical preliminary step of truly understanding the problem and its variables is done. So I mean, I can't stress that enough. I'll maybe stress that again in the next slide. But really defining the problem, the scope of what you're trying to do is probably the most important thing you will do in problem solving. The next reason having a structure helps is it ensures clear root cause analysis. And in my experience, an inability, sometimes almost an unwillingness to identify the root cause is the single biggest obstacle to problem solving. But I think once we figure out what the explicit steps are and add identifying root cause to the explicit step, it's much harder to ignore. The other reason I think it's helpful to have a structure is it kind of demystifies the problem solving process a little bit. When you sort of agree on each of the steps of the problems and everyone understands that these are the steps, then that process gives an opportunity for everyone to contribute and drives a team-oriented style of problem solving. And what you will find mostly, I don't think I need to tell you this, but I'll say it anyway, is most times you will end up working in teams, and having a common structure for everyone on the team to align to is actually really helpful. And just to reiterate, I think it's less important which problem solving method you choose than actually just like picking one and using it. Like you can even make up your own method. And so I'll only talk about one example here, but like if you research, there's many, many different ways to go about this. So that's sort of my key takeaway from this slide. Moving on, I'll walk through about 7 key steps of the problem solving process. So the first one is decide which problem to pursue. And this goes back to defining the problem statement. And for some reason, I don't know why this step seems to be left out in many problem solving methods. And maybe it's just an assumption that participants will automatically know which problems are worth tackling. But I think this is hardly ever the case. In most organizations that you will work in, there are countless opportunities for improvement, but very limited finite resources to apply. And so you need to be able to prioritize and dedicate resources accordingly. So there's many ways, many different tools for this. You can have pie charts, flow charts, have some sort of voting, but you do need to, like, as a group, agree on what problem you're trying to solve. The second step is define the problem, and maybe we need to get. I'll give us a couple more examples as we go through. But what I mean by defining the problem is you need to get a very clear and succinct problem statement of exactly what you're doing, which means include the details of who, what, where, when, etc. Like, and for example, if you get a call from a customer and saying, hey, this piece of equipment is not working right, it's an almost useless problem statement. Like, you need to get very specific. You need to define, like, what is the root cause of this? What is the definition of not working? Which, is there a part that's not working? When did it stop working? So you need to really be able to drill down to it and get down to defining the exact problem. The next step is determining the root cause, and identifying the root cause directly precedes from the previous step. One typical mistake I've seen people make at this step is mistaking a symptom for the root cause. And often the so-called root cause is more than just a restatement of the problem definition, but really thinking through and saying, hey, is this a symptom of something deeper? Or is that the actual problem you're solving? So you really need to get to that. The next step is generating possible solutions and choosing the most likely one. So once you determine the root cause, you can brainstorm as a group. The trick, I think, here is to have a wide variety of solutions as opposed to like just one thing. And this is where having a group and brainstorming together with people really comes into the highlight. And I think one of the things that I found from experience is the solution that has the strongest chance of succeeding is the one where all the relevant stakeholders are accept it and buy into it, and that truly addresses the root cause identified in the previous step. The next step is just planning and executing the vision. The reason I have this here is that even the best solution can fail if the implementation isn't carefully planned and executed. And in my experience, this process includes sort of two distinct phases. The first is getting all the stakeholders to buy in. So you have to like do a little bit of pitching and selling and have a methodical project plan to ensure it's executed. It's also helpful, in my experience, to keep anyone who might be affected by your implementation of your solution in the know, saying, hey, this is going to come, or this is something we've aligned on with senior leadership and we're going to be implementing on this, and this is how I think it'll affect you. So that way they know it's coming. If they need to make some changes to their processes and things like that, they can do it. The next step is verify effectiveness. I think this is something that I have personally found to be very critical in my specific job, because a lot of the times we have medium or to low confidence hypotheses. And so we want to test something and see if it actually results in the solution that we're trying to get to, and either improve it or scrap that idea before we implement it in full. So we typically end up doing a pilot on a small subset of the problem and then verify the effectiveness. It also, in my experience, doing it this way, verifying the effectiveness also helps in avoiding a bias, whether it's in internal or external customers that could have this bias. And I think just remember that perception tends to be reality in these kind of scenarios a lot. So really being able to show that, hey, we did this test on a small data set and it's actually leading to this result helps get your solution implemented. The last step here is communicate the results and congratulate. I think this is another one that's pretty often forgotten in many organizations that I've seen. And I think at the end of the day, you're going to be working with people. People are more important than that problem you're solving, and you want to be able to recognize people, congratulate people, and give them a sense of accomplishment. So that's sort of why I kept this here. I know maybe I'm probably going too fast, or is this okay?
I think you're good on pace, Caleb.
Okay, cool. So next we'll talk through one of the techniques of problem solving that I have found to be helpful. And we'll go through at least 2 examples, hopefully. So the first step here is the situation and the complication, or SC. They really help define the problem you're solving, and that results in a defined problem statement. Once you have a defined problem statement, you can write or frame your question, which would then follow the hypothesis. Before I proceed, I think I'll share a couple of thoughts here and give an example. Spending a chunk of time on this step is very, 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 very important. I cannot stress this more because it identifies what constraints and dependencies you're working with, what are the desired outcomes. So an example of a bad problem statement is, how do we grow business in India? A good problem statement would be, how do we increase revenue for X product by 10% in the next 2 years? And the reason this is better is because it helps you avoid scope creep. It helps you sort of boil the ocean and solve for everything. It makes sure you have a clear, well-defined problem statement. A hypothesis example, and I'll share this here, is actually, let me share a little bit what I mean by hypothesis. A hypothesis must be a falsifiable statement, meaning it can be disproven. And an example of this would be, all signed in customers use the search bar. So this is a hypothesis. But if you know at least one customer does not use a search bar and is signed in, the hypothesis is proven wrong. And I like to write hypothesis statements as if and then, and I'll give an example as we go forward. Just to reiterate again here, one second. The situation helps you understand what is the context or baseline knowledge you need to have before you understand the complication, or really helps define, how did this problem come about? The complication helps you understand what has changed and why do we need to act now, and why is this an important problem to solve? And then question explicitly states what problem we are trying to solve. Lastly, hypothesis states the hypotheses that are being validated. And then once you do these, all of these should automatically lead to the answer, which is, what is the solution to the problem? What are the specific recommendations or the next steps? One thing I'll say before proceeding here, it feels like when you look at the structure, there is only one answer, but that's typically not the case, because what ends up happening is, once you have a clear defined question, you end up having many sub questions below it, and then that will have many sub questions. But you eventually need to get to a point where each sub question has only one answer, or no, you can't break it down any further. And I'll talk through that sort of structure a little bit as we go forward. Okay, let's go to an example. Let's say this is there's an automotive unit of a company X that is losing money. After you find a few questions, you find this is not an actual problem, but a symptom of a deeper issue. So the situation here could be something like, the rate of production of cars at this company has dropped by 30%. And then the complication here, which is why do we need to solve this now and what has changed, is that the attrition of the factory employees is higher. And so then your question or hypothesis might be, if we reduce attrition and increase production to match the demand, then we can increase the revenue. So losing money would be addressed in this way. And specifically, the key question you would try to answer is, what can company X do to reduce attrition so that the rate of production can match demand? And then once you like really dig into this, like you might think of reasons why people are leaving. There could be a work stream that looks at, oh, other people, employees are unhappy with what we are doing. Are there external factors, like some other company has come and it's offering more money to the same employees with the same skill set, and they're able to join? And so there could be many different ways that you could solve this, but this would be the key question, and then you would branch out into different sub questions. So on that note, I will I already alluded to this, but the way we would do this is, and I would introduce another tool here. So aside from SCQH, the next step is issue tree, which is how you would solve it. So you start with building a tree with that key question that you have defined at the base of the tree, and then think of mutually exclusive sub questions you need to answer that main question, attach them as stems to the tree, keep going until each question is an individual work stream. So I'll give you an example here. So can we create a viable business platform for online landscapers? And when you break that down, there could be 4 different ones. Is the market large enough? Are there barriers to entry? Can we operate profitably? Is there a sustainable future for this market, et cetera, et cetera? And what you will notice here is that no 2 questions are overlapping. They're all in different work streams, and that is very critical as you build out your issue tree. And you could break that down into further things, and then break that down into further things. And then when you get to the last step is where you can actually have each line item be a work stream, and one person could do it, multiple people could do it, et cetera, et cetera. It's probably not worth spending too much time on these best practices here, but I'm sure, Natu, these slides will go out to them, and so you can read it, but maybe at a high level, one of the key things in terms of the content is, what I found what's helpful is write out each question as a complete sentence. Make sure everything is mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive, and then be as specific to the problem as possible. And then there's a few other things like formatting, but you can always take my template and copy paste that, so that'll take care of those things. I'm just keeping an eye on time here. I feel like I'm doing okay on time. Okay,
you're doing good. Yep.
All right. That brings us to the end of the problem solving section. I'll move ahead to data-driven decision making, and actually start with a story here. So I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but in Jan 1986, there was a NASA space shuttle called Challenger, which had a disaster that basically combusted and broke about 73 seconds into its flight, leading to the death of all 7 crew members. Pretty tragic scenario. But one thing that came across through this example was how data was not really used correctly to help make a decision. And hopefully with this example, you'll kind of understand how important it is to use data correctly to make a decision. So just some context here. This is what the design of the rocket looks like. There are rocket boosters attached to the main capsule, which has the astronauts. And one of the key things here in these rocket boosters, there are basically different parts, and there's something called O-rings, which is these, you can almost picture each of these lines as having one O-ring each. And it's a key failure point because it plays a critical role in joining all of the solid rocket boosters. One of the key data points that the team at NASA needed was to know what the temperature of the O-rings would be, because O-rings were made from material which could elongate or combust depending on the temperature. And so there was a lot of data available. The engineers knew about the O-ring recovery versus time by temperature. They had tracked O-ring damage in the field earlier. They had data from all the previous flights. But if you look at this graph, there's no clear trend line anywhere. It's almost like a U, which they didn't even draw. And then even with that, the graph didn't show any data points where there was 0 incidents. Sorry, just to recap, on the x-axis, you have calculated joint temperature, and on the y-axis, you have number of incidents. And each data point corresponds to a flight. And so based on this graph, what they recommended was, hey, if the temperature is greater than this data point here, 53 degree Fahrenheit, there's fairly low chance of failure. And so they recommended that the launch should be when the temperature of the O-rings is more than 53. But this data, I believe, wasn't presented correctly. And the chart was, like I said, missing the data points of 0 failures and did not show temperature of launch day. So if you look at this chart with all the 0 data points, now you can clearly start to see a trend line, but there are a few outliers, obviously. But as you can see, like, for example, this one was an unrelated problem. So this is a trend line, and these are the flights with no incidents. And the other big thing that this graph has is this line, dotted line here, which says, on the day of the launch tomorrow, the temperature will be around 30 degree Fahrenheit. And so I think hopefully now this goes to show why they shouldn't have launched on that day, or waited for a right day. And the reason I took this example, I know this is a bit of an extreme example, but and there are many different nuances which I didn't necessarily go into, but using data correctly can really be, in some scenarios, a life or death scenario. But I don't mean to minimize it to just those life or death scenarios. Using data to drive decisions on a daily basis is very, very important, and over time it adds up. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about here a little bit from my experience on why I think you should use data to make decisions. I think the first thing is, when used correctly, it prevents gut-based decisions and eliminates the human or emotional side of the decision making. It's easy to point at data and say, hey, this looks right, or why maybe this doesn't align with what we think might be happening, or at least it initiates the question of, oh, why does this, how do we know that, like it allows people to ask, that data point looks weird, how do we know that? Or and just putting the data up even in front of people allows them to think and ask questions. And the last thing I think here is, it highlights what assumptions we are making, meaning what data is missing. Like, so if you go back to the example on the Challenger, all the data points where there were no flight incidents were missing. So maybe the assumption there was, if those data points are not added in the chart, maybe the assumption there is, oh, we always have incidents, for example. There's never a scenario where incidents don't happen. Or incidents are not related to O-ring temperature, whatever that is. Like, that couldn't be another assumption, right? So I think having those, having the data in front of you and putting it in front of your team and people helps highlight that. The next thing I want to talk about is, what do we do in real world with data? The first thing is a lot of you might already know this, but in the real world, we rarely have complete or perfect data. A lot of times the data is clean or messy, not clean or messy, and you have to probably spend some time um, doing some data cleanup and things like that. The other thing I have found here is sometimes in my experience, you can have too much data. And so it's helpful to work backwards from a hypothesis that you have, and then just try to see if you have enough data to prove or disprove that hypothesis. And so that way it helps really narrow your focus. Um, so another thing we can do in this like less data is use the Pareto principle, which says that roughly 80% of the consequences come from 20% of the causes. So thinking through what is the most important data that you need. Do you just have that, or do you have the sufficient quality of data to be able to do that? So those are my two other examples. And I'm almost actually wrapping up on this, so we probably have a lot of time for questions. But one example I'd like to end here is at Amazon, we have a leadership principle called "are right a lot," meaning leaders are right a lot. And the way Jeff Bezos describes this is people who are right a lot, listen a lot, and people who are right a lot change their mind a lot, especially. And I remember in one of the all hands, someone asked him, "Hey, how do you actually get better at this leadership principle? Are right a lot. It just seems like either you have it or you don't." And the way Jeff Bezos answered that was, the way I think of, he said, I'll answer this by telling you what I see common in the leaders who exhibit this leadership principle well. Um, he said, these are the kinds of people, in my experience, who actively seek out data that challenges their assumptions. And when they get new data, they change their assumptions and they change their mind. And I think this is easier said than done because most times people just seek out information to bolster their own current belief and tune out opposing opinions. But I think this is where you need to actively seek that data that challenges your assumptions. Um, I feel like I've been talking for a long time, but also the time has not gone that fast. So maybe we can open it up for questions now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Caleb. I mean, it's been eye-opening. It reminded me of our MBA classes in some ways, so that's
Yeah.
been nice. But I mean, before we jump in, like I can't share enough as to how important defining the problem is. Just sort of reiterate what Caleb was saying up front, right? It There are so many instances, and I can't stress how important this is, where people are just like, yeah, let's try and solve for every problem on the planet. Like that's not how you actually arrive at a solution. You'll just end up doing nothing. And then the last thing that Caleb said, I think, is extremely, extremely important, where you need to listen actively. And actively is a very important word in that statement, because it's easy to pretend that you're listening, but you're sort of still only listening to what you want them to say, which is what you want to hear, because that will be the only thing that actually promotes your agenda or your belief or your hypothesis in some ways, right? So, um, you should always listen actively with an open mind and not be afraid um, to change your thoughts, right? I mean, it's data doesn't lie and evidence doesn't lie. So I can't tell you the number of times leaders in my organization as well have actually asked straight up, right? Like you put some slides together where you say, hey, we recommend you need to solve this problem using method X. And then literally the first question that comes out is, what evidence do you have or what data do you have to actually justify this recommendation? Um, and if you've done your job well, you should be most excited to answer that question, right? Because you're actually backing that up properly with meaningful information. So that's always been an approach that's also worked for me. So just sort of adding one more person's perspective in the workplace, I think it's just extremely important. And I think another piece that's also critical is who you choose to get feedback from and who you choose to listen to. Um, Again, it's easy to listen to find people who might share the same view as you. And if they all say the same thing, it's almost like groupthink, and you end up getting direct answers from them. So you should choose a group that will challenge, a group that is diverse in their thoughts, and it does go a long way. I've seen that may make a difference in the way you sort of arrive at meaningful solutions as well. So just wanted to throw that out there. All right, so let's jump into questions. Let me just take a look at what's there on Pigeonhole. But for those who haven't haven't posted their questions yet, just log on to the link in the chat, pigeonhole.at, and use the code 28May22. I will, Caleb, if you don't mind, maybe stop sharing a screen and I can maybe start sharing. And then maybe start presenting the questions on the screen, and then we can take them one by one. All right, so all right, just if people want to just scan the QR code on their phone or just go to pigeonhole.at, put in your questions. We'll see what we have so far. So we have, okay, good. So we have a few questions that have come in at this point. Let's just take them one by one. So there's a question which is, where does a long-term plan come into action? And how do I know how big of a problem statement and how big of a scope can someone handle?
Yeah, can we have the person who asks, if you don't mind, I know it's anonymous, but I'd like to understand a few clarifying things before I answer their question. If you don't mind coming on video, that would be great. If not, I can, if you want to still say anonymous, that's fine. I can answer the question. But maybe I'll give it a few seconds.
Video or audio, whoever submitted it.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if they can unmute themselves, but raise your hand or drop in a chat message.
Yeah, drop in a chat message. Essentially, I want to try and understand the context behind this question a little bit. Like, what does it mean by, what do they mean by long-term plan?
Maybe start answering the question, Caleb, and if that person feels comfortable or still on, then.
Let me answer the second part of this question first, which is, how do I know how big of a problem statement and how big of a scope I can handle? The way I think about this is, the best way to understand the scope of the problem is to actually first break down the problem into all its respective sub questions and parts. Once you get down to the lowest level of that issue tree, like the third or fourth level, whatever that is, I think then I have found it in my experience, it's easy to estimate, oh, this will take 1 day, or this will take 1 week, or this will take 5 weeks. The way I do this is, I think regardless of like your position in the organization or whatever that is, if you have been asked to work on a problem, it's your responsibility to at least come up with what all it takes to solve this problem, what are the work streams, and estimate how much time it would take to go actually get the answers for each of those work streams. Once you have that data, then I think it's okay to go back to whoever has given you the problem statement and say, hey, based on my estimate, it's going to take 15 weeks to solve this problem, or 3 months to solve this problem, whatever that is, right? And that will help you have, again, like going back to data-driven decision making, it will help you have a data-driven conversation with whoever has asked you to solve this problem, and give them a chance to like either push back or challenge your assumptions. So that's on like how much time it would take. The second is like how much influence you actually have. So you might find there are some work streams where your current position in the organization doesn't give you access to that level of detail or information, and even identifying that, saying, hey, this is probably something the finance team needs to do, or this is something the marketing team needs to provide me an answer on. And then you can hand that clearly defined problem statement over to those respective teams to give you an answer. So that's the way I would answer this. I don't know if this is a really good way to understand this, but I think it addressed the root problem of like, hey, I have this big problem statement. I don't know what to do, how much I can handle. That's the way I would approach it. Where does a long-term plan come into action? I don't know, Nattu, do you want to take a first stab at this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it boils down to, again, like what Caleb was saying earlier, right? When you go down to that third or fourth level of the issue tree, when you start getting a sense of what are all the possible questions that need to be answered to actually arrive at a meaningful answer for what your key question was, right? At that point, you'll have an idea of how long it might take essentially to sort of solve for those problems, those sub questions. And that will then help you devise in the short term, like what is the low hanging fruit that you can potentially sort of look to address. Like you may not be able to solve, 100% of the problem in the first year, right? Or the first few months or whatever. So you could break down, if I'm understanding the context behind the question properly, the way I'm looking at it is, hey, I think I can solve exactly what Caleb was saying earlier, 80% of the problem with maybe answering 5 questions in, let's say, 4 months or 3 months or whatever it is, right? And then you're like, longer term, you still want to answer the whole of the question. Or let's say if it's something like, I want to grow revenue by 10% each year for the next 3 years, you're like, you can't do it immediately. So you probably say, I can grow revenue by 10% in year one, but I need to invest some more time or invest some more resources in actually understanding what more needs to be done to get to that sort of end goal, which is maybe year 2 and year 3, right? So that's kind of how you could potentially plan for the longer term aspect, wherein you're like, this is kind of what else is needed, and this is how addressing things in the short term might feed into the longer term plan, which might still answer your goal. So that was my take. I don't know if that was a context behind the question, but I don't know, Caleb, if you want to add anything else.
Yeah, I mean, without knowing the context to behind the question, I think that's the best I would be able to do as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Let's just mark this as answered. Did someone have something to say? Okay. All right. So next question is around, how do we see, where we went wrong? For example, in the NASA report, you saw the cause, but how do they actually get to the root of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way I have found in my example, in my work experience, is asking at least 5 whys. It's a pretty common tool, like it's called the 5 whys tool. So let's say, take for example the Challenger blew up example. So ask, why did the piece combust? Okay, it combusted because the O-rings gave away. Okay, so why did the O-rings give away? That happened because the temperature of the launch day was much lower than the temperature at which O-rings tend to perform well. The O-rings had contrasted. Okay, so why did we not know this information on when the O-rings perform, how the O-rings perform at a low temperature? You might find that, oh, we actually never test the O-rings at a lower temperature than 50 degrees. Okay, so why do we not test that? Oh, it's maybe because O-rings are manufactured by a company that is based in a location where the temperature never goes down. Okay, so now we know we need to test the O-rings across a wide variety of temperatures. Sorry, 1 second. On launch days and help. So that will help us give us the data. So that's, I think, one tool that I found. Maybe Nattu, you can add some more.
Yeah, I think even something like a fishbone diagram is another tool that is used for root cause analysis, right? So the 5 whys, I think, is a great way to sort of start and arrive at like the actual root cause. In the industry, we have also used fishbone analysis. So that helps you break down, your actual sort of issue down to its constituent parts. And that will help you sort of check, what's going wrong. And another thing that I would also maybe add is, and I know Amazon is very, very, very good about this, is actually using and defining your metrics upfront. So when you're recommending a solution, you need to have a way to even track its effectiveness. So Caleb had mentioned, verifying effectiveness in one of the steps of the problem solving stages, right? Which is towards the end. So you absolutely need to spend time saying, okay, I'm going to test out, let's say Amazon Music is launching a new button, right? There has to be a way to track how good it is. You can't just launch a button and, pray for things to work out, 2 years from now. So when you have that, you'll have an idea of what success looks like. And if it's not met, you can actually get into understanding the why, which is 5 whys, root cause, whatever, right? And get to that piece. So that way you'll know if something went wrong and then why went wrong. So I just thought I'll add that as well.
Cool.
All right. So okay, so this is an interesting one from Yash. Just around the example that I think that you had shared around the wage issue, right? So if you want to take this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for those who are not on the video or can't see it, I'll just read out the question. So in the example that Caleb had shared initially around situation, complication, and hypothesis, and then ultimately the key question, he was asking, Yash has asked, why can't the situation and the complication be interchanged? And how did he decide that the root cause was actually attrition and not decreased production? Which is a great question.
Yeah. So one thing, one way to think about this is what is an input versus what is an output. And in my experience, the situation tends to be usually the output, and the complication tends to be the input. So you might even argue that in this example, attrition is the output, and you need to think through what caused that attrition, and that's what is the input to that. And I think, for example, maybe Yash, your example on decreased production leading to lower wages, that's not the way I would think about it. I would think about it as alternative wages are higher somewhere else, which is why people leave. You rarely ever find companies reducing salaries, and so that's the way I would. That's why I changed that phrasing. So that's input and output is one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is the difference between situation and complication. Is the complication helps really answer why now, why, what changed, and so in this particular example, it wasn't as clear that one thing happened before the other, but you will usually.
Suraj, if you don't mind going on mute, I think there's some background noise coming from you.
Maybe Anusha can mute him. I don't know. So yes, Suraj, in this, a lot of times it could be interchange, but the way I would think about it is the complication helps really answer why now. And the other way to think about it is what is the input versus the output. So the output tends to be the situation and the complication tends to be the input.
And I think it's also a function of defining your problem also, right? Like what
Correct.
problem are you actually solving for? Like this company was keen on solving for their production issues as opposed to solving for a nutrition issue, right? If you frame your problem around nutrition, solve for that, right? Um, which would have a different complication potentially.
Yeah.
But great question. All right, so another question is, if possible, please give an example from Amazon regarding problem solving and data-driven decision making. And this person
Yeah.
also thanks you for your session.
Sure. One of the things maybe start to get, I'll try to keep it less technical, but it's a technical example in its nature, so I can't completely avoid it. So one of the things that we noticed for our Amazon Music app recently was there is a large user perceived latency on our apps. So when you click something, it takes more than a few seconds to open up. And the problem is exacerbated a little bit more when you go to low network areas or countries where bandwidth is lower. So that was the problem statement. Hey, we have a high user perceived latency of up to 3 to 4 seconds, which by industry standards is too high. If you look at some research on user perceived latency, customers expect something to happen within 3 to 400 milliseconds. Whether it's a loading bar, whether it's some pieces of the page loading, etc., whatever it is, like that's the goal, and where we are is like at 3 to 4 seconds, so a factor of at least 10. So that was a problem statement. We had to break this down to like, hey, what are the various parts where this latency could occur? And if you think about the technical architecture, there's usually an app, but then the app connects to a server, and the server has some business logic where it does various logic handling before it delivers to the customer. So that's one side. The other side is this network piece where we are dependent on a phone's network strength to be able to access our server, etc., etc. So there's like 4 or 5 different areas that we had to look into. And then once we looked into all of the areas, saying, hey, here are the things we need to investigate a little bit more. We had teams focusing on each different part. And then we came back with some data saying, hey, this is where, this is what's happening. So I'll give you an example. So if you go to, I don't know if you'll be able to see my screen, but if I go to the Amazon Music app and go to the home page, there's like,
Go ahead and share your screen if you want to. Oh yeah, we can see. Yeah.
I'm showing it on my phone. So you see this like one big widget called My Soundtrack, and then various different widgets. Once we sort of did the analysis, what we found was that this top widget, My Soundtrack, is the one that takes the longest time to load. And then once we dug into it, the reason it was taking a long time to load was the API call that we were making to the service that was providing us that input was taking long. Okay, that is one factor. The other factor was, oh, this is a high res image, and maybe loading that on the screen is taking longer. And so we looked at all these different data points on like what parts of the page are taking how long to load, which part of the chain, like whether it's a call to the server or it's the downlink back to the device, that are taking time. And so we were able to identify that if we focus on solving this My Soundtrack problem, which is 20%, 80% of the problem would be solved. So we prioritized solving that, and the other things happened later. So a couple of things we did was pre-fetching or caching that device, caching that information on a device. So that helped with some things. And we did a bunch of other things. I don't want to go into the technical side, but really like focusing and identifying what's the problem we're solving, which part of this problem, if we do, solves 80% of the problem, and then going and implementing.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Caleb. Great answer. And good question.
Good question. Yeah.
One more question. So can you go through the issue tree in a little bit more detail? How did you ensure that you got a set of mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive set of questions?
I'll go back to my example, but I will say that it takes a lot of time and practice to get to this. What you're seeing is definitely the finished product. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what much to say apart from saying that you need to practice. But there are some templates on like what you could use. So for example, if you're solving a business problem, one of the things you could one of the temp structures is think about market, competition, customers, and competitive forces. So that's what it is. This is market, other barriers to entry. This is competition. Can we operate profitability? And then this is like future. Is it, because one of the things saying in this question was a viable business. So I thought through, okay, that means there needs to be a sustainable future. Getting this first one, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, is probably the part where you need to spend the most time on, because if you don't get this right, you might miss a big chunk of work streams. After this, I find it like relatively easy to think about like the ones that are broken up. So let's take, for example, profit is a function of operating profitably is a function of operationally accurate and financially accurate. Like there's two angles to it, right? So break that down into those two. For having a sustainable market, you need to be able to grow and retain the customer base. You need to understand if the overall market is going to grow bigger, or is there a cap on how much you can grow? And then are there any diversification? Like if you build online landscapers, then are you able to set up your business to be able to do something else if the online landscaping market goes away? So I don't know how helpful this answer is, but I would say two things to reiterate. One is practice. You need to get practice, get feedback from other people to see how you're thinking, and then probably spend the most time on getting this first branch of the tree right.
And again, it doesn't need to be perfect, right? Like
yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, exactly.
Like the goal is thinking about every potential possible sort of root cause to that question, right? And what factors might influence it. And as you think about it, you then sort of start asking deeper and deeper questions. And one thing that, maybe that might be helpful is if you understand that if one particular question might fall under one bracket or the other sort of bucket, then you just identify which bucket makes the most sense, right? And sometimes you may find a bunch of questions that might sound similar. So then you group them together to make them sort of, collectively exhaustive, right? So that you're not asking the same questions in 5 different ways. That's basically the point of it. You're trying to exhaust all of your possible sort of questions, and you're also making sure that you're keeping structure such that it's not, you're asking the same question in a million ways. So that's basically the purpose. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it's just a thinking mechanism, essentially.
Yeah, and like I said, it's a tool at the end of the day. It doesn't need to be perfect. The fact that you're doing it and spending more time on thinking through this before you even go into the problem is probably better than 90% of the people who are trying to solve the problem.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You'll be surprised as to how many people actually don't end up even thinking at this sort of grassroots level, which might seem obvious to many people, but like people in the real world, let's face it, they may not have time, or they just don't want to go there, right?
Or so don't know, and hopefully this session helps in the knowing part.
Nattu, do we have time for one last question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
So Caleb, my question is around human emotions not getting in the way of decision making. Now, this is a hard one, right? It's a classic case of your system one. You want the answer to be what you believe in. Are there any tools or models, mental models that you have found effective for yourself? I'm assuming this is like a long process. It requires a lot of self-awareness, etc. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thought is that you cannot escape it. There will be some level of human emotion involved. And I think going into those discussions, expecting it a little bit, almost is a necessity. Like you kind of have to expect it and think about how you would go about it. The other thing that I would say again, that first one is a little bit more in your control, right? Like just go in expecting it and figuring out how to deal with the human side as well. The second is maybe a little bit more a consequence of external or like the environment, which is I found it much easier to do this when the overall culture in the organization or the team is to drive to make data driven decisions. Like I guess I have it easy because Amazon is a very data driven company, and it tends to be like data. If you have the data, regardless of your position or title, everyone accepts it. So some of it is cultural, but I've also found that it's not an either or, right? Like it's not you're either a data driven company or you're not. It's like a scale. And I think if I think about it as a scale, I as an individual can push this, even if I push the scale a little bit to the right, that's a good enough win. And I think thinking about it like that helps me go into a conversation saying, hey, let's keep, like even just stating that statement, hey, let's keep our personal biases and emotions outside of this discussion. Let's just look at the data objectively. Here is the data. Here is where it aligns with maybe our gut instinct and where it doesn't. So that's the second point. And the third point I would say is I found in my experience, it's helpful to have both data and customer anecdotes or whatever anecdotes, whether it's customer or internal. And when the customer data and the anecdotes align, you have a lot more confidence in presenting that data. And so it's actually easier to get people aligned when both of those are aligned. And again, in my experience, when both of those diverge, like customer data is saying one thing, but the anecdotes are saying another thing, I always doubt the data more than the anecdotes. Like I start with the assumption that, okay, I don't think this customer anecdote is motivated by anything for it to be incorrect. And so then I'd like dive a little deeper on the data. I don't know if that answered your question. Maybe Nattu, you can provide your perspective as well.
Yeah, I know. I think you said it brilliantly. I mean, it helps to sort of ask, the question of, again, like what evidence do we have, and keep asking and probing questions, like however stupid it might sound. What's worked for me as well as, and again, like our company, as Caleb mentioned, like we're not as data driven as an Amazon, right? So we're sort of behind on that scale. I find it like my job in some ways to actually sort of just keep asking people why, right? And what's the backing or the reasoning behind your question. And obviously, a lot of it is tone, right? So you shouldn't challenge it with the perspective of, or you shouldn't showcase it as I'm just here to, poke holes in your assumptions and your hypothesis. That's not the point, right? Like if you have a tone which basically says, hey, like, I don't know much. I'm just trying to like actually understand objectively what the answer to this question might be. People have a very different response at that point, right? So I think just sort of changing that as a mental model in some ways might also be helpful, and it's proven helpful for me. And yeah, it just boils down to, like, once you sort of start creating those muscle memories around, bringing evidence, bringing data, people start seeing value in it. Because you'll start hearing examples of failure stories where people may not have done enough, we call it discovery, wherein you're sort of just going out in the market, getting information, validating your hypothesis, and then sort of launching a product, for example, right? You'll find that often the failure stories are when people have not done enough discovery or validation, which is exactly what Caleb was talking about in terms of customer anecdotes and data collection in some ways. So you sort of start building that memory, it automatically starts getting credibility, and your position starts being more credible naturally. So I think that's just what seems to work.
Yeah, one thing I'll maybe add to sort of tie this in. I know there are scenarios where you might end up working with people who are not really interested in the data. They just have pretty headstrong views about it. And I think at the end of the day, like, the people make the decisions, like the data doesn't make the decisions. So I think you have to do what you need to get and earn the trust of those people who are the ones really helping you make the decision. And once I think you have that trust and build that trust on a personal level, then I think your data-driven suggestions will end up becoming decisions.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Thank you. And thanks, Caleb. Wonderful session, and really appreciate your time.
Yep.
All right. We're at the top of the hour. Any other final questions? If not, I just have one quick slide before we wrap up. All right. Cool. So I'll just share one quick slide just to sort of, wrap up the session. Again, thank you so much, Caleb, once again, for such an insightful session. I know it's early in the morning. So thank you for sparing, Saturday morning for this. Thanks to the Spark team, obviously, who have sort of, put this together, and the ICT social media team in sort of pushing this out there to get participation, and also the BITS team, right? I mean, one benefit of us having reached out to a non-ICT alum, which I think has been really, really helpful, is we get traction from other universities, and that completely aligns with Spark's vision to sort of help people, across India, right? So this is kind of our first take on trying to also expand. So obviously this was because of Caleb in many ways, but we got connected with one of Amar's friends, Bhargav, who has been nice enough to get us through to connect with the BITS. I guess it's the alumni network and the student network after that, right? So huge thanks to them as well. And again, please give us feedback, right? It's the data that we use to drive our decisions on what's best for Spark. And if things don't seem useful, then we're all ears. But if things seem useful, then please tell us what's working and what you'd like to sort of see in the future as well. So please take the time to fill out that form. It's in the chat. Write to us, right? Write to us if you have any sort of follow-up questions. If you feel like you didn't want to post any questions in this particular session or forum, please reach out to us. We'll try our best to respond as much as possible. And yeah, I mean, take a look at our website. We have a bunch of really cool content. And if you do want to sort of stay abreast of what's going on with Spark mentoring, then please check out our website, and we'll have sessions lined up. You'll see recordings, you'll see what this looks like as well. So if this is kind of what our website looks like for those who aren't familiar, you can see that these are all of the programs that are there, upcoming sessions. If you go under whatever topic or module that we spoke about earlier, so this is, for example, our Achieve session. You can scroll back in time, see earlier presentations, earlier sessions. It's all free. So please, feel free to leverage this. We have a blog as well with some useful content. So explore Spark and see what's useful and write to us on things that you think would be helpful for you as students and for us to sort of touch upon as well. So yeah, with that, I think we'll wrap up today's session. So thank you once again, everyone, for joining, and thank you, Caleb, for taking out the time today.
Thank you. Bye.